Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much for everybody for introducing themselves. So I think we can proceed to start with the presentations. Today we have, as said in the introduction, we are very thankful for the availability of our colleagues from GetTransform. Taking a look at the time, I think we should proceed with the presentations. So shall I give the floor to Ashley, Mr. Ashley Wynn and his team? Please, Ashley, you can now start with your presentations. We normally have a short break after each presentation, and that can allow for some questions from the audience. Okay, since we started a little bit late, I suggest that we can go with today's presentations a little bit more far away from 11 a.m. So probably until 11:30, so that we have ample time to discuss and address the questions or comments that will surely arise. So colleagues from GetTransform, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, and I will also be very quick and hand over to the presenters. So we're going to present a presentation about the mini-grid tariff analysis that was conducted in Mozambique, and then could talk about how a tariff methodology was applied in the case of Sierra Leone. This presentation will be delivered by our expert Nico Peter-Schmidt in English, but we have the slides in Portuguese. And following that, we'll have a question time. You're welcome to pose your questions also in Portuguese because we have our translator with us. Following this, there will be another presentation on the integration of roles and responsibilities in the mini-grid sector that was developed where the framework was developed in Uganda. So firstly, let me now hand over to my colleague, Nico Peter-Schmidt, and I would request for Diego to put the slides up, please.
Yeah, good morning, everybody again. Thank you, Ashley, for the introduction. I will now present on the revenue requirement tariff structures that we analyzed for the Mozambican case. So what we actually did is we took a revenue requirement model that we developed for another country. So we have done like similar models for Nigeria, for Sierra Leone, for Ethiopia, and so on. And this time we took it from Ethiopia and adjusted it to the conditions in Mozambique with some specific features that we believe would suit the Mozambican case best. And then we fed it with specific data that we collected from a Mozambican village back in, it was 2014, when we were conducting a little exercise for FUNAI on the design of a mini grid in Mozambique. So at the end, this tariff calculation is now fully aligned with the conditions in Mozambique, and therefore we believe that the results are relatively well representative for the specific Mozambican conditions. I will start off with a quick introduction into the revenue requirement tariff model, then introduce the sample project characteristics. As I said, this Mozambican village that we designed some years back, like that we designed a mini grid for some years back, a solar mini grid. And then I will talk a little bit about how tariffs usually develop over time. As tariffs, according to the revenue requirement model, are adjusted every year, and they change over time basically to reflect the development of demand in the community and the development of cost levels with the mini grid operator. Then we will go into sensitivity analysis on the tariff level, like how does a change in CapEx and OpEx and demand, rural industrialization, and the capex subsidy levels affect or impact the tariff positively or negatively. And finally, we'll talk about delivery models, as tariffs are always linked to certain delivery models. If you want to achieve a certain tariff, then just related delivery models can be applied. Some delivery models cannot be applied to reach a certain tariff, and so on. We'll talk about that later. This is the quick introduction into the revenue requirement tariff scheme. It's basically a balance, and that needs to be well understood. Tariffs are not a political instrument at all, right? Tariffs, as soon as they are used as a political instrument, and if you bring this balance into like out of balance, basically, then at the end, somebody will suffer. It's sometimes it's the customer, sometimes it's the electricity company, supply company. At the end, the economics don't work anymore. So therefore, the the role of the regulator is to keep the scale always in balance and make sure that the OPEX plus depreciation plus allowed return minus subsidies is always the same as the tariff multiplied by the kilowatt hour delivered. And that can also be on the next slide, be seen from the formula, which is basically now represents the same as shown on the balance. It's like the revenue requirement, like is the figure in terms of money that a mini grid operator requires to operate the system sustainably. And that consists of the operation and maintenance expenses, the depreciation, taxes, and then the regulatory asset base multiplied by the rate of return. The regulatory asset base is basically the value of the assets installed multiplied by a return on the investment that is defined through a WACC, a weighted average cost of capital. And then what we recommend is to also add, especially for delivery models with a very high grant funding rate, a performance-related profit margin to attract the private sector to these type of systems. Because if there wasn't a performance-related profit margin, which is basically just a top up on the tariff that can serve as a certain profit for the private sector, then the private sector would not be interested, because in systems like in mini grids that like the private sector can only earn a profit, make a profit based on the investment made. If there is no investment made and the private sector just provides operational services, then the private sector cannot make any profit. And that, of course, meant at the end that the private sector would not even invest. So that is, yeah, well, this is the calculation base. Only non-subsidized assets are considered for the regulatory asset base. I said that already. So therefore, like any capex grant and subsidies are subtracted from the revenue requirement. Next slide. Let's go into the sample mini grid that we in some time back analyzed in Mozambique. The actual village was Naburi community in northern Mozambique. It was at the end indeed connected to the main grid, but we did an exercise and designed a mini grid for it some time back. And we believe that the conditions in rural communities in Mozambique have not changed significantly in the meantime, so that we believe that this community may be a representative case. Now, what we see here is that we have like 512 households with a total of 574 connections. meaning that 62 connections are related to shops and workshops, productive users, commercial users, and so on. The village is like wired with a 12-kilometer low voltage distribution network, and the power station consists of 60 kilowatt peak photovoltaic, 33 kVA diesel generators, 202 kilowatt hour battery storage. In this case, this was lead acid, and a 52 kilowatt inverter. The average daily demand was estimated to be 200 kilowatt hours. Now, the total capex, according to like latest capex reviews, would be $501,000, which is 26 million local currency, and the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital, is 18.7%. Now, on the OPEX side, we assume that $12,000 per year would be required, and the equity debt ratio would be 50% equity and 50% debt. Now, what I have to say here is that the OPEX has been assumed really, really low, because we assume a fully digitalized mini grid with low OPEX. If a less digitalized mini grid would be deployed, then the OPEX would go up significantly, and that at the end leads to a higher tariff. Fully digitalized means that the money comes in through like digital means, for example, mobile money if existent, or any other kind of transfers, digital transfers. The operations is overseen through remote monitoring of the generation assets. Ticketing systems are being used to service the customers and to provide support through mobile phone, telephone, through a call center. All of that is included to reduce OPEX, and this is how we end up with these 915,000 Metical per year, or the $12,000 per year. Now, let's move into the tariff calculation. On the right-hand side, you see the parameters that we use for this calculation case. We assume a 70% capex grant, 88% renewable energy fraction, 30 mini grids in one portfolio, which is very important. We will talk about that later. If you just have one mini grid in the portfolio, then the overhead costs basically drive up the tariff. And if you can subdivide the overhead cost through 30 mini grids, then of course the tariff goes down. And 30% duties and taxes on generation assets, meaning photovoltaic modules, batteries, diesel generators, as applicable in Mozambique. Now, what we see here is the tariff like changes over the years. This is an effect of the demand increase over time. So when you start a mini grid, the electricity demand is relatively low, which means that you have your constant fixed cost and you divide them by a relatively low numbers of kilowatt hours delivered, which results in a high tariff. And that tariff decreases over time. So now if you we actually used some methodology to reduce this decrease. And this is what you can see here. Can I please ask everybody to mute their microphone? It's a little bit difficult to present if microphones are open. Thank you. Now, we end up with this scenario at 48 Metical per kilowatt hour, going down to 33, 31 Metical per kilowatt hour. The spike in year one would even be higher if we didn't use a certain methodology, which is the activation of OPEX over the first years. Then this tariff would, like in the first years, would even be much higher. But as we deployed this methodology of capitalization or activation of OPEX during the first years, this tariff is already relatively flat. Now, the second line that you see here is indicating what happens if you remove the 30% duties and taxes on generation assets. And you can see that this already has a significant impact, going down, like tariff going down from 48 to 43, or over here from 31 to 28 meticals per kilowatt hour. Let's move to the next slide. Now, this is the tariff. As I said before, if you do not use the activation of OPEX during the first years. Next, and well, if you use the straight line depreciation, like there are two methodologies that we used here: activation of OPEX plus like in the slide before. Diego, please move one slide back. Like here we use two methodologies to keep the tariff rather flat. This is the activation of OPEX plus a annuity type of depreciation, which reduces the tariff during the first years. And now the next slide shows what happens if you use a straight line depreciation, meaning that the spike in year one is even higher. Next slide. Now let's go into some CapEx sensitivities. The CapEx here indicated as the regular CapEx as the 100% in the middle of the diagram, leading to a long-term average tariff of 33 meticals per kilowatt hour. If you now vary that CapEx by like minus 25%, for example, you move from 33 meticals to 25 meticals per kilowatt hour, meaning that this is a significant reduction in tariff. But like the question is like what CapEx reduction can be expected in the long run? Of course, we are expecting PV panels and batteries and inverters to reduce in price over the long run. We do not expect that much the distribution network assets to reduce in price over the long run. So therefore, a 25% reduction is probably already on the higher side. But I guess that something like between 15 and 20% can very well be expected over the next 5 to 7 years. Anyway, it means like this also indicates that it does not really make sense to wait, right? Some countries say, well, let's wait until the next tariff reduction actually, also CapEx reduction actually happened. But the curve of tariff reduction is already going into a flat, the CapEx reduction is already going into the flatter part. So therefore, I think now is a good time to finally enter into the mini-grid deployment. Next slide shows the OPEX sensitivity on tariff. Now, as I said already, the OPEX has been assumed to be already very low, like in a fully digitalized mini-grid. Now, if you do not have the mini-grid fully digitalized, you would probably have an effect of 200% of the assumed OPEX, which increases the average tariff over time from 33 meticals per kilowatt hour to 36 meticals per kilowatt hour, meaning an increase, a linear increase of 3 meticals per kilowatt hour. So now if you reduce, and this will be very hard according to the assumptions, the challenging assumptions that we already made, further reduce the OPEX, then there is a potential of reducing the tariff by 1 metical if you reduce by 25%, which is in an achievable range, but probably very challenging for the private mini-grid operators. The next slide shows the impact of the demand on tariff level. And here you actually see that the demand and the scale of the deployment of mini grids has a very strong effect. It's not linear as the capex or the opex effect. It's rather a heavily declining curve right from the beginning, and especially the demand, like this is the great area, 100% demand, which is again the 33 meticals per kilowatt hour as a reference case. If you decrease that from 100%, like if you cut that into half, like from 200 kilowatt hours per day to 100 kilowatt hours per day, you shoot up the tariff from 33 meticals to 51 meticals per kilowatt hour. So we have to say that we've simulated this with an optimized system again for each of these nodes, which means that each of these systems has been calculated individually. We're not using the same system and varying the demand for the same system. In that case, the curve would be even much steeper on the left-hand side, and you would probably see a much higher tariff than 51 meticals per kilowatt hour if you cut the tariff into, if you cut the demand into half. And then accordingly, also the diesel fuel consumption has been adjusted to that new case. So you can also see that if you move from 200 kilowatt hours to 300 kilowatt hours per day of electricity consumption, you can see a significant reduction in tariff from 33 meticals per kilowatt hour to 26, which is a significant decrease. And the example below here, if you double the electricity consumption from 200 to 400, you can actually go from 33 to 24, meaning from $44 to $33, meaning a tariff reduction of 26%, which is a significant impact. All right, and now on the next slide, I would like to talk about rural industrialization. And rural industrialization with mini grids is, let's say, high up on the agenda of the sector at the moment. Like the understanding is that now, as the mini grids are fully digitalized and mini grid operation is relatively straightforward nowadays, it's not that complicated, not as complicated as it was some 3 to 5 to 7 years ago. Basically, everybody who can operate a company, like manage financially a company and manage staff and do a good accounting and controlling job, can actually operate mini grids. Well, the design and implementation of mini grids is something else. That is where you need the expertise and experts for. But the actual operation is not that complicated anymore because you can do everything from your computer. Whenever something goes wrong, a red button flashes kind of and says, hey, there is something wrong in this mini grid, please fix this and that. You can oversee your like how your call center works, how your tickets from the customers are being resolved or maybe not being resolved, depending on how well your call center works. You can see the mobile money coming in if exists, and then you can see how your assets perform. All on that is basically happens on your computer screen, and you can really see and print reports and have the full picture from there. So it's relatively straightforward. Now, this opens up some new opportunities to think beyond just electricity supply and mini grids. And that is what is called then rural industrialization. You basically use your mini grid to open an access to a market that lies behind the mini grid and that is not accessible without the mini grid. And let me explain using this slide here. In some rural areas, you have excellent local goods. They may be agricultural goods, they may be fish, they may be livestock, they may be wood, timber, they may be minerals from artisanal mines, like all different types of small rural production and is already existing. usually. In many cases, the production is relatively inefficient, to be honest. And the transport of the goods is usually relatively expensive. So like if you compare to like the same goods being manufactured or produced closer to the urban trade hub, these goods are not really, like in rural areas, the goods from rural areas are not really competitive with the goods that are produced closer to the urban trade hub. And therefore, usually the goods are too expensive and they arrive at low quality and in many cases already perished. So therefore, there is usually no trade from, or little trade from rural areas to the urban trade hubs. Now, with a mini grid and the rural industrialization approach using, for example, the Keymaker model, which is one of the models that that has been designed for rural industrialization, the mini grid then can create economies of scope. They can create synergies with the local production of goods by, for example, setting up local pre-processing facilities. And if the mini grid operator then takes over all activities that the community cannot take over because of like knowledge and capacity limitations, like financial management, like logistics management, like accounting, controlling, these kind of things, negotiation, legal aspects of the business, negotiation of contracts and so on, which the mini grid company usually has as a capacity in-house already, then through the local processing, the amount and volume of the goods produced in a rural setting can be reduced significantly. Transport costs reduce, the quality of the product increases through local pre-processing, and then finally the products can be delivered and sold to the urban trade hub because they are competitively priced due to the lower transport cost, and they have a higher quality. And then suddenly the cash flow flows back into the community, and rural industrialization actually happens. So the important part is that at the end, industry and the mini grid operator may share hands, like the industry that uses the products from the rural areas. They join hands and they share the profits of the overall business among themselves. So that is the introduction to the rural industrialization approach. And I've already seen in various talks with Mozambican stakeholders that even like also Mozambique is very much interested in this. Let me tell you that other players like SIDA and World Bank and so on are also thinking about this to make this like put this on top of their agenda for the next wave of mini grid rollouts. And right, the main effect of rural industrialization actually is not just making the mini grid company profitable and owning, like helping them actually break even much earlier, but the rural industrialization also increases the consumption on site. And this increase in consumption actually means like what I have shown in an earlier slide, that the tariff can be reduced. Here are some examples, like a large, like if you just have a milling only community, the tariff is like, and we're looking at one mini grid in the portfolio here. You see that the tariffs are much higher. We've been talking about 33 Metica per kilowatt hour before for a 30 mini grid in one portfolio scenario. Now we've got one mini grid in one portfolio, and this is the base case here. It's just like milling and some workshops, some productive use for local consumption. We start off with a tariff of 43 Metica per kilowatt hour. Now, if you add some fishing rural industrialization model that involves some deep freezing of fish and delivery to Maputo, for example, then the tariff can already go down from 43 to 32 Metica per kilowatt hour. Now, if you go into large-scale irrigation, various, like several hectares around the community being irrigated operated by the community in collaboration with the mini grid operator, then the tariff goes down from 43 to 29. In a mining community where like a traditional artisanal mine is then upgraded to a professional, let's say still like community driven, but professionally equipped and managed mine, you have the potential of even go down to 25 Metical per kilowatt hour. Now, if we go to medium industrial appliances like large ice machines, right, for large scale fishing or something, or even go to even larger ice machines like 10 tons per day is a significantly large industrial production facility. The tariff can even go down further to 19 or to 14 Metical per kilowatt hour potentially. So this is the economies of scale that you see if you bring industries into rural areas and connect them to the mini grid. Whereas we have to say that these industries also need a relatively low tariff. So this goes somehow, somehow can become a virtuous cycle if managed and introduced properly. Now, let's go to the next slide where we look into the impact of subsidy and scale on tariff. We've been talking about the impact of an increased number of kilowatt hours on the tariff, and we've seen that this is like in one mini grid, if you increase the demand of electricity, this has a significantly like effect of reducing the tariff in mini grids. Now, if you increase the number of villages under one management, this has a similar effect. And you see here on the x-axis, the capex subsidy level, on the y-axis, the tariff, and then you have various curves indicating the number of villages. So if you have, and then here the dotted line is kind of the level that most of the governments in Africa are trying to achieve, roughly these 30 cents per kilowatt hour level that can be achieved here, for example, with a 50 villages under one management approach plus an 80% capex subsidy, right? So that is the, just to indicate what other governments and other African countries consider a sweet spot. Next slide. Now, if you reduce taxes, right? If you just remove the 30% duties and taxes on generation assets, then suddenly you see that the tariff drops. Like if you go back to the former slide, you see that the $30 cents, like the 24, 25 Metical per kilowatt hour, can be reached by 80% subsidy and 50 villages. Now, if you go to the slides where we reduce the taxes, then these 80%, these $30 cents per kilowatt hour can already be achieved by approximately 10 villages and 80% subsidy level, or potentially even with 50 villages and something like 70% subsidy level. Now, removing these duties and taxes is probably one of the most immediately required steps in Mozambique. Let's move to the next slide. Sorry. We've been talking about tariff levels. We've been talking about the degree of subsidy, of capex subsidy. And what also comes into the picture here is the degree of government control. Now, there are for each combination of subsidy level and tariff level, there is a certain degree of government control assigned, and there is a certain delivery model assigned to that. So, for example, if you wanted to achieve a $30 per kilowatt hour tariff, or say a 33 or 25 or whatever Metical per kilowatt hour tariff, then you can look into this diagram and say, well, how can I achieve this? Potentially, like the split asset model only, which usually results in a 30% grant, 70% private sector investment scenario would lead to a tariff that is much too high for the government's tariff expectations. Private with capex grant, like if you have, let's say, as we said before, a 70–80% capex grant, well, you can go down with the tariff, also significantly, also beyond what this tariff line is now showing. If you go a hybrid split asset grant, you've got a similar setup. Like there is a significant reduction possible if you go into an ESCO setup, because the ESCO setup is where the private sector does not invest at all. This opens up some like easy avenues for public OPEX, like continuous OPEX subsidy flowing into the mini grids. Usually it's difficult for governments to subsidize continuously ongoing subsidize private sector companies. But if the private sector company is just a service provider, then the business and the assets owned by the government could be cross-subsidized in a continuous manner. What we learned already is that in Mozambique, this will most probably not happen, if we understand, because of potentially budget constraints. So therefore, we would probably end up with a model that is a little bit further on the right here. But I wouldn't exclude the ESCO model because one can play around with it as a government relatively easily. And then, of course, there's the EPC utility model, where in the Mozambican case, EDM would operate mini grids itself, and then would be able to then cross-subsidize from potentially city customer tariffs to rural customer tariffs. The next slide shows the same as the diagram before in a slightly different way. It basically indicates which political imperatives, which financial and operational public capacities are required, and how that leads then to the delivery model that the government at the end has to select. And honestly, the selection of the delivery model somehow then at the end also determines the regulation that needs to be set up. Like, for example, if you go for a utility-driven model, then there is not much regulation required. It's basically a direct political interaction. There may be some technical regulations required, and then everything else follows the routes of the main grid regulation, basically, because most probably in this case, rural customers would be expected to pay the same tariff as the main grid customers. So whereas if you bring in the private sector, and that is where you move further to the right, like the more private sector you bring in, the more regulation you require at the end. And the like more private sector you actually engage, the higher the effort for the regulator, and the more detailed and the more precise the regulation actually has to be. Because a regulator may easily be very well overwhelmed by applications if suddenly 100 or 500 or whatever mini grid application end up on the regulator's desk, and the people in the village don't want to wait for years for the regulator to take a decision on tariffs and other things, but this is supposed to then happen quite quickly. So therefore, more effort needs to be taken to then design the regulation and then potentially also digitalize certain parts of the application procedures. All right, that was it regarding the the scenario for the Mozambican tariff regulation. We can go into a quick Q&A session if you like, or I can immediately proceed indicating how Sierra Leone has taken, like what approach Sierra Leone has taken and how they implemented their tariff scheme.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think we can take one or two quick questions if if there are any immediate burning issues. Also, colleagues, remember you can ask your questions in Portuguese. That's no problem. Okay, Nico, I think we can then proceed with the example from Sierra Leone.
All right, let's have a look into how Sierra Leone actually did it. Diego, can you bring up the Sierra Leone slides? Okay, let me start in the meantime. Sierra Leone actually implemented a cost-reflective mini-grid tariff framework. We will now have a quick look. Like it's a relatively short presentation, a short version of the long presentation that we prepared for other purposes. It's basically an insight into the current status of mini grids in Sierra Leone, a policy and regulation survey, like what do they actually do with policy and regulation of mini grids in Sierra Leone. Then we look into the tariff methodology and the results, and we like draw a few lessons learned from the application of cost-reflective tariffs. Slide 3 shows the like mini grids that have been implemented in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone has started some 4 years back approximately to electrify health clinics, health stations in rural areas to like as an activity following the Ebola crisis, to make sure that future crises like health crisis, like the Ebola crisis, do not have such a devastating effect on the rural population. So therefore, at that time, DFID, the British government, and like hired UNOPS to implement the RREP, which are 97 mini health stations that have been electrified. And then they hired my company Nensus, and we told them, hey, how do you want to operate these in the long run? Experience shows that if you just donate them to the health centers, they will probably fail after a few months or years. So if you convert them into mini grids and ask the private mini grid operator to operate the mini grids and supply electricity to the health center for free, then most probably it's like the likeliness of a sustainable operation in the long run is higher. And then, well, DFID said, well, it's a great idea, let's do that. They set up a proper budget for it, and UNOPS then hired Nensus to help them implement this project. And well, at the end, as I said, 97 mini grids have been installed. Most of them are in operation. Some of them are being like finalized and will be commissioned within the next few months. And we found 3 strong private sector operators to pick up the operation of these mini grids, and they also invest, right? They bring significant private capital into the country to invest into mini grids under a split asset model for the larger mini grids and a kind of ESCO model for the smaller mini grids, right? Where the private sector investment is much less in the smaller ones, and where in the larger ones, where you have, as I said already in my former presentation, where you have larger demand, then economies of scale kick in, and then the tariff level can be acceptable, or let's say stays on a certain level, even if you increase the private sector contribution. That was the wish of the government. And on the next slide, you will see how this reflects in regulation at the end. the government said we want private sector investment because we want to leverage as much as possible the grant money that we have, knowing that this would at the end result in a certain tariff level. No, in Sierra Leone, there's no specific agency for rural electrification. They are working on it. They would like to establish one, a rural electrification agency or similar, but they have not come to that level yet. So everything is managed by the Ministry of Energy. The mini-grid regulations have been developed over 2-3 years, starting 2016, and they have finally been published in 2019. My company, Nensos, has been supporting the regulator in drafting these regulations. There are 2 mini-grid licenses, the basic license and the full license. The basic license is applicable for systems with a distributed power of smaller 100 kilowatts, and the full license is applicable for systems with a distributed power of between 100 kilowatt and 10 megawatts. Under the basic license, the tariff negotiated with the community. Under the full license, it's a standardized tariff calculation tool that is being deployed, similar to the one that I presented in my previous presentation. Also with the features of the amortization, depreciation, and the activation of OPEX over the first few years to keep the tariff constant over time. And then there is a tariff, like in the basic license, there's a tariff review. If 60% of the clients sign a petition to get the tariffs regulated. In practice, these 100 kilowatt of distributed power are not really assigned to the per mini grid perspective, but they are, from the regulator, they are assigned to the portfolio of mini grids operated by a company. So, and as all companies in Sierra Leone operating mini grids, or most of the companies, let's say, are beyond the 100 kilowatt level with their portfolio, all are undergoing proper tariff regulation by the regulator. Okay, now let's go into the next slide. On the right-hand side, you see a column which is cut into certain portions. The column shows the tariff in dollars per kilowatt hour, and you can see here how it's split. Like relatively large parts is operation and maintenance expenses. It is like this portion is higher compared to what I presented in my last presentation, because these mini grids in Sierra Leone are not yet fully digitalized. So they're still working on that. There is significant potential for cost reduction on the operational side if this is fully implemented. Then there's depreciation, return on investment, and performance-based profit margin, especially for the small mini grids where there is an ESCO model and there is basically close to 100% subsidy level, like grant funding level in the assets. So now the tariff methodology is, as I explained in my last presentation, and the tariff charging methodology is very flexible. Like mini grid companies can define the tariff schemes basically by themselves, not the tariff levels, but the tariff schemes. So they can charge energy-based tariffs, flat-based, like flat rate tariffs. They can have a fixed component and a variable component in their tariff. They can have a power-based component and so on. Tariffs are assigned to bundles and portfolios of mini grids, which is also very important to not have different tariffs from one village to the next. And the villages have been assigned in clusters to mini grid operators to make sure that, let's say, the villages operated by one mini grid operator are close to each other. That reduces transport cost and staff deployment cost, and at the end has a positive effect on the tariff. So now the tariff in Sierra Leone is relatively high. It's in the range of 80 cents to 90 cents per kilowatt hour. There are other examples in Africa with similar tariffs, but there are also examples with a higher subsidy level, especially for the large mini grids, where here in this case the subsidy level is just 30% roughly. in Sierra Leone. And when you go for large mini grids and increase the subsidy level to 80%, then you can go down to 30 cents per kilowatt hour. We see that in the Ugandan case later on. So now, this is already one of the last slides here. What have we learned from the application of cost reflective tariffs? The advantage is that the private sector brings in significant capital. And like funding, public sector funding can be leveraged quite well. You can see then economies of scale through mini grid clustering, because the private sector would anyway ask for mini grids in one cluster of at least some 20, 30, 40 mini grids. Like a sweet spot is 25, I would say 30. And beyond that, it makes sense for the private sector to come in. And then there are barriers. There is a willingness and ability to pay barrier. And in Sierra Leone, the villagers are indeed complaining about the high tariffs, and the policymakers, especially the parliamentarians from these areas where the mini grids have been deployed, are taking action basically. And there are debates and discussions in parliament, but also in the ministries of how the tariffs can be reduced, and potentially retrospectively, basically, the government is considering to bring in additional grants and subsidies to reduce the tariffs. And that would then mean that the tariff level is indeed then lower than the 80 to 90 cents, would go probably to 50 cents or even below. Yeah, well, for productive use, high tariffs are of course difficult, because with an electric mill that pays some 80, 90 cents per kilowatt hour, you're not competitive with a diesel mill. So people like millers would probably stick to diesel and not convert to electricity at that tariff level. So what does the government do? So like they are, as I explained before, they are promoting rural industrialization actively. They are trying to motivate. They are motivating the mini grid companies to look beyond just electricity supply and become active in rural industrialization using the keymaker model. And they are also trying other measures to further reduce the tariff, for example, through tax exemption and, as I said, additional subsidies. Okay, that was it from Sierra Leone. We can go into questions and answers now, or we can move on to the Ugandan presentation.
Thank you very much, Nico. So you can open the floor now for questions or reflections. I think we have a very good audience today. Different institutions that for sure might have some point, yeah, considered or give some thought to many of the concepts that you have shared with us this morning. It was a fully packed cocktail of many useful reflections and tips. So I think it's good that we give ourselves now some time for comments or reflections. So please, let's open.
Thank you, Nico. I think the presentation was very good. Both presentations, and this on the case study of Sierra Leone is really an eye-opener for us in Mozambique. Definitely it establishes a basis for the government to intervene in the arena of policy and policy support. Now, I think countries like Sierra Leone, they took the challenge. We have asked the government of Mozambique to not to do the whole steps, but to do a few of the steps to reduce import tariffs in such a way that these projects become more accessible. I have seen, surprisingly, that without any support, the cost per kilowatt can go up to 100 meticais per kilowatt, which is really are. So yeah, it's a big battle, but if we want energy for all in 2030, this is the only way to go. I just wish that there is more people in the government level at the policy drafting that really work on these presentations. I have no questions. I think this was really a good presentation for us to start thinking how to move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. Let me maybe quickly react to this. The intention of these presentations was not to show that mini grids are only costly, right? If you look into all the electrification options, mini grids in many cases are, even though they result in relatively high tariffs, still the cheapest option, like compared to main grid extension or even compared to solar home system electrification. So therefore, and of course, as I said, mini grids have the create the opportunities to deliver electricity in a reliable manner and in a very powerful manner to rural areas that then enables, and that is the, like from my perspective, the main feature of a mini grid, to enable the mini grid to, like the rural communities to develop and to develop rural industries that create income and jobs. So, and I believe that income, jobs, and mini grids, that has to be thought together, like thought through together. This is somehow coupled. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In fact, it would be nice if you could compare the Mozambique situation or what we may do in the future with the two realities, the Sierra Leone and the Nigeria one. In fact, I was waiting for Nigeria presentation in order to make some consideration on it.
Yeah, maybe I can like tell a few words about Nigeria, because we have been also heavily involved there as Inensus. We drafted the regulation. We also kicked off the first pilot systems, and we also supported World Bank and REA Nigeria in setting up this $170 million grant funding scheme for mini grids there, which is now being rolled out. So therefore, the Nigerian case is somehow special compared to other African countries. Nigeria is a very much like economically driven country that is driven by let's say like full capitalism, you could say. Yeah, it's like it's basically a highly competitive and highly, let's say, competition driven economy. So therefore, people in rural areas accept tariffs that are higher than the main grid tariff more easily. Now, for example, if you compare to Ethiopia, where you have a socialistic communistic history, and a more like centralized, like centrally organized economic setup, like the people in the rural communities definitely expect to pay the same everywhere in the country, no matter what it costs, right, to the government. So therefore, like you have like Nigeria is specific in this regard. Indeed, the tariffs in Nigeria are somewhere in the range of some $60–70 per kilowatt hour, which enables the rural communities to develop certain rural industrial applications based on this electricity. And Nigeria is specific in regards to the liberalization of the electricity sector. They have discos all over the country, private sector distribution network operators that unfortunately do not live up to their mandate fully and have not really been able to profitably electrify rural villages in a reliable manner. Electricity in rural areas, even connected, if they are connected to the main grid, is very, very poor. And that provides some openings for mini grid companies to come in and provide electricity to these areas at a higher tariff on the one hand, but at a very reliable, in a very reliable manner, right? And only the reliability of electricity, if electricity is delivered in a reliable manner, then rural development can actually happen. So yeah, and that is what has been picked up by World Bank, and AFDB followed, and now I think they have got some $250 million in their REA fund to distribute as grants to the mini grid sector, and they selected private sector. This is also very specific to Nigeria, under a performance-based grant where the private sector gets a fixed amount of, I think it's $350 per kilowatt hour. Sorry, dollars per connection. Sorry, dollars per connection made as an RBF, like ex post. Disbursement is ex post after installation and connection. And they have, as a second implementation scheme, an MST, a minimum subsidy tender, where the government selects, or REA selects, clusters of sites, like 20, 30, 40 sites, like villages in one cluster, and then they are tendered out, and the bidder, the technically compliant bidder with the cheapest tariff, with the minimum subsidy, like with the lowest subsidy requirement at a given tariff, wins the bid. So that's it. That is a quick overview of what is happening in Nigeria.
However, I would, if you not make a specific presentation about Nigeria, what I would like to make some considerations. First of all, I can see that here in Mozambique we are not so far than the ones that you presented. In Africa, we do have one specific area at the energy ministry that takes care about the renewable energy. Although we do not have one electrification law, we are working on it, and I hope that law consider specifically the issues related to the renewable energy. But meanwhile, we are busy doing the law. Sorry, we should also think about one electrification plan, rural electrification plan, that consider that both issues we are charging the electricity by the national tariffs, stipulated by the EDM, or we are driven the tariffs according the costs. We should have one, on my understanding, one rural electrification plan that thinks and clarify this. In fact, I think it is quite impossible we make profitable that business if we are not able to control all the variants. I mean, if we are not control, for instance, the duties and the VAT, that it's very high on this, and I think we, as Mr. Kamal mentioned, we should be exempted on it on rural electrification projects. It will be difficult we adopt in full one social tariffs, the ones that is used by the electricity of Mozambique. At the same time, I would like to make another consideration. I think that we should have, we do have AREN. AREN is energy regulator that consider the electricity, both electricity and petroleum derivatives. But I think that we should think about one authority specifically orientated for rural electrification, because I think a lot of challenge will pick up if we try to go, or if we try to develop this kind of electricity development. On my understanding, it is not only as you mentioned, before. It is not only related to the renewable energy. Even the ones who wants to say the ones who are, for instance, 20 or 40 kilometers from a main line, and wants to make one derivation to their own project for 20 or 40 kilometers. You have to buy the cables, you have to buy the transformer. But at the end, the population around will be able to make derivation, and the quality decreases a lot. And how to deal with this? I think we should have one authority specifically orientated for this case, not only for renewable energy, but also for the expansion of the electrification on rural areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Frade. I think we have today in the session different focal point contact people from the different institutions, from AREN, from EDM, FUNAI. So I think now we can invite you to also have your say from the institutions, your comments or your positions or some reflections. I think now it's the perfect time to do that. So please.
Yes, for Mr. Neko, I want to make some question about your presentations. I saw in your presentation that the government of Sierra Leone make a change in regulations, and that bring main developer to develop mini grids. But the developer, I face a problem because the people have limited to make payment. Even people with productive activity, they saw the tariff very high. So the mini grids are there. Some of them in developing. What the government are making to solve this problem? Because the developer want to make money. They build the mini grid, but the people have a problem to make a payment. So I want to listen from your experience from Sierra Leone. What the government are make for solve this problem?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Now, the discussion, the debate in Sierra Leone around the tariff has various facets. On the one hand, people say that, well, those rural communities, the individuals in the rural communities, they pay now less than they paid before for light, for mobile phone charging, for all these kind of basic services. Like, even if the tariff is at $80 to $90 per kilowatt hour, the services now are like come at a significantly lower cost to the community already. So that is what they say. But the communities, of course, they indicate clearly that they are not accepting a tariff that is so much higher than the main grid tariff in the city. And they know very well that the tariff in the city is also subsidized, right? Heavily subsidized by government. And they say, well, if you subsidize the privileged urban customers, why don't you also cross-subsidize our electricity tariff, government, right? And that is now what is currently being discussed. Is it fair to subsidize the urban customers' tariffs with an ongoing subsidy from the national budget, while the rural customers just got a capex grant that came from the British government, and now no further subsidies are being provided. So that is the main discussion, and that at the end culminates in the discussion around, well, like, why is the difference so large, right? Like, can't we make it a little bit fairer and reduce the tariff? And I think it's less a willingness and ability, like it's less of an ability to pay issue, because, as I said, services are now cheaper than before, right? Even as the tariff is very high, it's rather a willingness to pay. Sorry, a willingness to pay issue, because people consider themselves to be treated unfairly, right? And that is the discussion. And like your question was, what does the government do about it? Yeah, well, they are now discussing around tax reliefs, like kind of a waiver for value-added tax for electricity, which would already have a significant, or they call it GST in Sierra Leone, GST. That would have a significant reducing effect on the tariffs. And then they are discussing additional subsidies that would not come from the government itself, but would come from donors. But the donors usually don't like to subsidize an existing project. They like to set up new projects, right, with additional money. So it's an ongoing discussion.
Thank you very much. Any more reactions or interventions from our participants, from institutions, from AREN perhaps, or ADM or FUNAI? Okay, we have Irene. You can.
Sorry. I saw in the presentation. Yes. So I saw in the presentation key maker models.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Can you, in short
yes,
phrase, explain how
what the key maker model is about? Yes. Nico, please.
Yeah, well, the key maker model is an approach for using mini grids for rural industrialization. So the idea is that if you take all the efforts of bringing infrastructure into rural areas, setting up a business there, a mini grid kind of electricity supply business that requires a lot of capacities out there in these rural areas, like sorting out the logistics, accounting, controlling, financial management, all these kind of things, cash handling, and so on. If you have sorted out all of that, can't you use all this that you set up to just do more than selling, say, 1 kilowatt hour per customer per month, and run an industrial processing line and a trade business in the rural villages. And that usually meets with an availability of very special and high quality products in rural villages. And they may be agricultural, horticultural, they may be wood, timber, they may be minerals from artisanal mines, there may be fish, or it may be livestock like beef, cattle, for leather, for meat. And all of that somehow, in many cases, is not well coupled to the, or let's say, cannot easily be sold to the urban trade hubs, not to the larger city. Like it cannot really reach Maputo easily and still be competitive. And the key maker model is a concept to which is based on economic B product theory, economies of scope theory, where like the mini grid company could now set up a rural industrial processing and trading facility that purchases these excellent goods, processes them in the rural areas, creates jobs, creates income, and demand for products, and then processes them and sells them to the urban trade hub with the capacities that the mini grid company has in itself anyway. So that is the idea of the key maker model. So basically, like when you do your rural electrification plan, you would then not only consider what the least cost electrification option is, but you would then also consider where there are opportunities for industrialization of rural areas if there was a professional company on site with professional management capacity and a reliable electricity supply. And that usually changes the assignment of communities to like main grid connection or to solar home systems significantly, because main grid connection often does not supply electricity reliably enough. Solar home systems do not have the power required for processing facilities. So then in many cases, the mini grid is the option to be selected. And well, this all goes together under the topic of rural industrialization. And as I said, the key maker model is one way of calculating the opportunities out there in rural areas for rural industrialization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. Any other intervention in that sense? I think Irene from Soncofa is trying to make a comment. Irene, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Paul. No, I had just some small comments about the presentation. So the first one is I'm a little bit surprised by the tariff that is being shown, that I consider very low compared to what I've been observing in the different countries in the continent. To take one example, in the case of Sierra Leone, we are talking about tariffs around $0.8, $0.9 per kilowatt hour with 70% of the capex subsidized. So 30 cents seems very low to me. And also something to take into account that at the end of the day, if you look today at the countries with the most developed mini grid market, like for example, Tanzania, or in the case of Sierra Leone, that is already evolving, the tariffs, or Zambia, we are seeing right now are 0.7, 0.8, not below that. And we know, we start as developers, we start to understand the behavior of the demand confronted to that tariff, how much people consume if the tariff is around 0.8. If we go to a tariff around 0.3, we have no idea of how the demand is going to behave. Like if I go to a tariff that is half the usual tariff, is the demand going to increase the double? People are going to have a fixed budget for electricity? I don't know. And until now, there hasn't been a lot of studies on that sense. So I think it's something to take into account when investigating tariffs that right now don't exist in the continent. So that's the first point, and the second point is on the OPEX, and I agree with Nico that once the mini grid is digitalized, it can help to reduce a lot the OPEXs, but I think we are forgetting about all the SG&A that are still needed. Even like for the mini grid to work, to produce electricity, I agree that most of it can be done remotely, and then you have some maintenance. But on the human part, on the commercial part, if, for example, to give just one simple example, productive use, if we want people to change their milling machines and adapt the milling machines to a milling machine connected to electricity, you need to discuss a lot with the people in the village. You need to explain the economics. You need to provide them with a reason to make an investment into a new machine. And that takes a lot of costs in terms of SG&A and salaries, mainly on the side of the company. So I think that has to, and for us, at least as developers, we had to spend a lot of time discussing with authorities and several stakeholders in other countries, trying to explain this, that yes, there's all the part of the production, but if we want to provide a good service, if we want to develop the demand, we need to spend more in salaries and in people and in local people being contracted by the company. So those were my two main points.
Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Maybe can I react to that quickly?
Please.
That would be great.
Yes, Nico.
Yeah, Irene, you're right in saying that the 3233 medical that I mentioned as a reference point, which is $43 per kilowatt hour, is lower than the 80 to 90 from Sierra Leone, and even lower than the 60 in Nigeria that are set up. But as I said, we can, on the one hand, we have to compare with the we have to compare the funding regime, the grant funding regime. Like as you said, like in Sierra Leone, the grant funds are lower than in my scenario here. It's like not 70%, it's even lower than that in Sierra Leone. And villages are really, really small, whereas I here in Mozambique am looking at a village of 500 and what was it, 560, 70 customers. In Sierra Leone, we have villages of 100 customers and below in many cases. And we've seen what effect the size of the community and the demand in each community has on the tariff, right? So that is one effect. And the other effect is, as you already said, Irene, the digitalization rate and the OPEX rate. And in Sierra Leone, a large portion of the actual tariff is OPEX, right? And I already, like what I wanted to do here is I wanted to provide a vision to the government of what could be achieved, right? So if we start off with something that, well, yeah, saying like last year, the tariffs on average in Africa were like this, then the next discussion we will have is, okay, what may the tariff look like next year or the year after when our funding programs are ready and our regulation is in place, right? And I believe that at that point in time, like the OPEX must have reduced to the level that I am showing in my presentation. This is also a challenge to the mini-grid companies. I know that very well, but I think we have to somehow live up to that challenge and then somehow try to reach to that level. Otherwise, especially in Mozambique, I consider it very, very difficult to charge tariffs in the range of 70, 80, $90 per kilowatt hour. But this can be a discussion that I would love to have among all the participants here. What is a tariff level that would probably be accepted in rural areas in Mozambique?
Thank you, Nico. I fully agree with you that we cannot keep with this level of high tariff. I strongly agree with you. although that needs to be taken into account the two things I mentioned, the elasticity of the demand, the developers, we cannot take the risk of going to a low tariff without knowing how the demand is going to behave. There has to be some kind of guarantee, some kind of instrument to cover us from that, because at the end of the day, we will not find investors, because that's something to keep in mind. Developers, we need to raise funds to install these mini grids, to pay for the capex. And the thing is that if we go to investors and we say, okay, the tariff is going to be 30 cents, but I have no idea how the demand is going to behave, that's a problem. But we need to work together on that. It's not a challenge on the level of tariff. I agree it has to be lower, but we need to think how to hedge on the developer side about that, because otherwise we will end up in a situation like, for example, in Togo, in which the tariff is very low, but now there's a tendering process and a lot of developers are backing up and saying, okay, I'm not going to apply to this tender because we cannot find investors that are willing to take this amount of risk.
Right, agreed. Right, yeah, in Togo, that is where we are also active. Like the government somehow didn't really listen to our recommendations and wanted to push for a tariff. And it looks like they already have a company in mind that is ready to accept the low tariffs and still roll out mini grids at the required level and scale. So it looks like something is going on somewhere that excludes then many mini grid developers from other areas of with other origin, let's say. Yeah,
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a text in the chat box from Mr. Gildo Enrique Shigoi. He says he has a problem with his microphone, but he would like to comment about the issue brought up by Mr. Frade. He says AREN is in the constitution phase for work according to its competencies provided in the law. So this agency, AREN, the regulator, is already creating a set of work programs with a view to developing regulations to address issues related to investments in renewable energies, productive use of energy, extension of the electrification based on rural energies. So these issues at the regulator level are taken care of. That's the contribution by Mr. Enrique Shigoi.
Can I say something, please?
Yes, of course, Mr. Simone.
Yeah, well, from the CTA Natural Resource and Energy prospect, I fully agree with the previous lady that was speaking about. So in terms of, we have to consider that at the moment, that's a big program called ProLair, that is for the renewable energy for the project more than 30 megawatt. And even that is quite difficult to find developers that are interesting to invest. And because for the tariff, so with the tariff of ADM, I can consider that to be competitive, ADM has to ask some tariff that are very, very, very long from the one that was shown. Imagine in the rural area where the problem, and I fully agree, the problem is spend a lot of time and effort and human resource to change the mentality of the people. And in any case, you have to make something that is also easy for them, not complicate. One of my companies is also trying to do, for instance, store gas from biomass. It's quite difficult to change the mentality of the people, even if it will become cheaper. And because it's not so easy for them to cook. So you have to put on top of the cost of the developer, logistic cost and cultural cost. So I fully agree. The other things that Frade say, that for sure, the electricity law is under discussion, and the regulatory entity is under designing the program. So we are quite far to have a really rentable condition, environmental rentable condition for this kind of electricity. From the side of investor, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Simon. In the interest of time, I think we should proceed with we still have one more presentation to go. So unless there's any burning issue, I would suggest that we give the floor back to our colleagues from GetTransform, and we can enjoy their last presentation. So Diego Perez, please, the floor is yours with the last presentation on your side, please.
Bom dia, obrigado, Paul. Eu sou Diego Pérez, consultor do GetTransform. Eu vou apresentar a experiência das mini-redes em Uganda. A particularidade deste caso, do caso ugandês, é a integração de diferentes elementos dentro de um mesmo processo. Em particular, o financiamento, o modelo de concessões e o licenciamento. No caso do Uganda, eu trabalhei muito com a GIZ nos últimos anos. O Ashley, que também na chamada trabalhou lá, então conhecemos bem este caso. Talvez primeiro gostaríamos de apresentar o programa GetTransform muito brevemente. Como Ashley já falou, é um programa multidoador implementado pela GIZ, focado principalmente no setor público. É um programa que é presente em África, Ásia e América Latina. E as áreas de trabalho são o planejamento integrado em clima e energia, a transformação de sistemas de energia e o acesso à eletricidade, o que hoje estamos a falar. Este caso do Uganda é o caso que o Nico já apresentou do Serra Leoa, faz parte de uma série de estudos de caso que já preparamos como GetTransform e que já compartilhamos com a AREN, com o regulador, os quais apresentam diferentes modelos de implementação de mini-redes. Temos o caso do Uganda, o caso da Serra Leoa, mas também o caso da Etiópia e da Nigéria. Para estes casos, todos nós preparamos um documento e também preparamos as apresentações. E os casos têm uma estrutura semelhante. Temos a característica distintiva e depois temos os elementos, os diferentes elementos do modelo. A abordagem de implementação, a decisão, tarifas versus subsídio, a organização institucional, o quadro político e regulatório, o planeamento e depois também questões de mitigação de risco e de industrialização rural. O que é importante compreender é que cada caso tem uma característica distintiva muito forte, muito bem definida, e esta característica distintiva é o que vamos a destacar na apresentação. Então, no caso do Uganda, é o modelo integrado de concurso, no qual temos o financiamento, as concessões e o licenciamento no mesmo processo. Apenas uma introdução ao caso do Uganda. Uganda tem uma população de 42 milhões e um índice de acesso de 28%. Em 2016, o país tinha apenas 11 mini-redes renováveis. E naquele momento que foi lançado o programa Pro Mini-Grids, implementado pelos parceiros do setor energético do Uganda, como apoio da Alemanha e da União Europeia, através da GIZ. Como já expliquei, a característica distintiva das mini-redes em Uganda é a criação deste processo que integra diferentes elementos. Vocês podem ver este processo no diagrama. O que é importante explicar é que o setor público prepara os distintos requisitos antes do envolvimento do setor privado. Então, estes blocos lá, em azul claro, fazem parte da preparação pelo setor público, e depois temos as diferentes etapas do processo de concurso, no qual o setor privado já vai ser envolvido. Então, primeiro, no plano do setor público, temos o processo de seleção de localizações, de planeamento, a elaboração, a preparação dos contratos e a preparação de um mecanismo de financiamento. E uma vez que estes requisitos são desenvolvidos, o concurso público vai começar. E vamos ter um convite à manifestação de interesse, vamos a avaliar as propostas dos desenvolvedores, a fazer o licenciamento e a implementação dos projetos. Em muitos mercados de mini-redes, os próprios investidores, os próprios desenvolvedores vão realizar esta preparação de projeto. E o que é interessante no caso do Uganda é que estes custos vão ser assumidos pelo setor público, e os desenvolvedores privados vão ter esta informação antes de começar o processo de concurso. Então, nós achamos que este modelo tem uma série de vantagens, tanto para o governo quanto para o setor privado. No plano governamental, o modelo permite um maior controle do processo. Temos um modelo de planeamento top-down, no qual o governo vai definir as localizações, vai definir os contratos e as diferentes regulações. Temos também um processo de seleção que é transparente. O modelo de concurso permite uma seleção transparente e uns preços competitivos. E isso também vai atrair fundos de doadores e desenvolvedores internacionais. No ponto de vista do setor privado, temos estes custos mais baixos para o desenvolvimento do projeto, porque algumas etapas, algumas informações são já fornecidas pelo setor público. Temos também a vantagem das economias de escala, porque o processo vai integrar múltiplas aldeias. Os desenvolvedores vão poder desenvolver e implementar múltiplas mini-redes. E o apoio do governo ao processo também vai permitir menores riscos pelos desenvolvedores. Talvez, quanto às desvantagens que não estão no slide, é verdade que o modelo pode ser mais lento no início e também menos flexível para os operadores privados, porque, por exemplo, eles não vão poder desenvolver projetos em aldeias não identificadas, não definidas pelo governo. De um ponto de vista contratual, formal, o modelo pode ser considerado uma parceria público-privada, e uma vez que o concurso acontece, o contrato de concessão como vencedor de concurso vai ser um contrato de tipo BOOT, Build, Own, Operate, Transfer, com uma duração de 10 anos. O mecanismo específico de adjudicação dos projetos mudou após os primeiros projetos piloto. Inicialmente, o que tínhamos era um subsídio fixo e os projetos eram avaliados de acordo à tarifa proposta. O subsídio era fixo e a tarifa era variável. No futuro, a ideia é mudar este mecanismo, fixando a tarifa e pedindo aos candidatos que definam o subsídio que eles vão precisar. Es o que llamamos un modelo de concurso de subsidio mínimo o minimum subsidy tender en inglés. En este slide vocês podem ver essa evolução do modelo que agora expliquei. Inicialmente não houve nenhum limite tarifário para os 2 primeiros concursos. O que tínhamos era um subsídio bem definido, alrededor de 50% a 60% dos custos de geração e distribuição. E os resultados do concurso a tarifa resultante foi de em torno a 50 centavos de dólar, o que vocês podem ver no diagrama lá, mas esta tarifa foi mais elevada do que era previsto pelo regulador. Então, o que aconteceu é que o regulador fez uma nova política de mini-redes, na qual há um limite tarifário de 30 centavos, que podem ver lá, e então com este limite tarifário implicou a necessidade de um maior nível de subsídio para os projetos. Então, os projetos vão ter um subsídio em torno a 80% do custo de geração e de distribuição. Vendo em detalhe o modelo de financiamento, o que temos é diferentes componentes do investimento inicial. O investimento em geração é feito em parte pelo desenvolvedor. Temos um investimento privado de 50% a 60% do custo de geração e um subsídio baseado em resultados fornecido pela GIZ de 40% a 50%. Depois temos a distribuição, que é uma contribuição, uma espécie da Agência de Eletrificação Rural. E temos as ligações, que vai ser um subsídio baseado em resultados. Eles vão ser efetuadas pelo desenvolvedor e depois vão ser subsidiadas. Os números que vocês podem olhar lá em vermelho correspondem ao novo modelo que apresentei de concurso de subsídio mínimo, no qual o subsídio precisa de ser mais elevado. Vamos ter um subsídio de geração de 60% a 70% e no total vamos ter um subsídio de 80% do CAPEX e 20% contribuição privada. No plano institucional, temos lá o desenvolvedor da mini-rede. Podemos dizer que a REA, a Agência de Eletrificação Rural, é o ator principal, no sentido que ela vai acolher o processo de seleção de localizações, também o concurso e o mecanismo de financiamento. Depois temos o regulador, que vai emitir as licenças e aprovar as tarifas. E da parte dos doadores temos a Alemanha e a União Europeia, neste caso do Uganda, que eles vão fornecer financiamento pela GIZ para fazer assistência técnica e também para fornecer o subsídio do CAPEX. Em termos de planeamento, como que os locais foram identificados? Então, quando o programa começou em 2016, não existia um plano diretor, um plano mestre para mini-redes. Então, o que a GIZ decidiu foi de fazer uma análise GIS, baseada em sistemas de informação geográfica. E vocês podem ver nas imagens duas etapas desse processo. Temos primeiro a identificação de casas a partir de uma foto satélite, podem ver lá, e temos depois o resultado do processo de optimização com as diferentes soluções. Temos as extensões de rede em azul, as mini-redes em verde e temos também sistemas isolados, alguns sistemas isolados que podem ver no diagrama. Mas uma vez que o programa de mini-redes estava já em andamento, A Agencia de Electrificación Rural, preparó un master plan en 2018. En este master plan, las mini redes van a ser consideradas como una alternativa si el costo de la extensión de red es mayor de $1.100 por ligación. Si el costo es menor, entonces la aldea va a ser conectada a la red. Si el costo es mayor de $1.100, entonces las mini redes van a ser consideradas como alternativa. En este proceso tenemos alrededor de 600 localizaciones de mini redes identificadas, las cuales están siendo consideradas para un programa de mini redes financiado pelo Fundo Verde para el Clima, o GCF. En términos de regulación, la verdad es que los elementos existentes son bastante comunes a otros países. Tenemos un mecanismo de isenção de licença para projetos abaixo de 2 megawatts, a ideia é de reduzir os custos e os prazos administrativos para os desenvolvedores de mini redes. E desde 2019, o regulador está a desenvolver novos regulamentos de mini redes mais completos, os quais vão incluir normas para cálculo de tarifas, normas técnicas, cenários de interconexão com a rede, os quais vou apresentar a seguir. Mas estes novos regulamentos não foram aprovados, isso é uma fonte de incerteza no momento. Em relação ao quadro regulatório, temos dois riscos particularmente importantes. O primeiro é o risco de demanda, que Irene estava a falar, e o segundo é o risco da chegada antecipada da rede. No caso do risco de demanda, o modelo ugandês, o risco de demanda é asumido pelos desenvolvedores das mini redes, não é um risco que o regulador vai assegurar. Mesmo assim, a regulação é flexível e permite usar diferentes estruturas tarifárias para reduzir este risco. No caso da figura, é uma figura que é muito clássica no setor, vocês podem ver um modelo de tarifa misto, no qual temos uma parte fixa e uma parte variável, e isso vai permitir aos desenvolvedores de ter mais receitas e de reduzir o risco de demanda. E depois, enquanto ao risco da chegada antecipada da rede, o que o novo regulamento de mini redes vai oferecer são diferentes alternativas para o desenvolvedor. No caso que a rede vai chegar, o desenvolvedor de mini redes vai poder escolher entre diferentes opções. Temos a opção de tornar-se pequeno produtor de energia, na qual o desenvolvedor da mini rede vai produzir energia e vai vender esta energia na rede principal. Temos a opção de distribuidor de energia, no qual vai continuar a vender energia aos clientes da aldeia, mas vai ter também a possibilidade de comprar energia da rede principal. Temos a opção de combinar produção e distribuição. E temos, finalmente, a opção de concluir o contrato, de finalizar o contrato e de abandonar os ativos. Em cada caso, a nova regulação especifica a fórmula de compensação econômica que vai ser necessária. Então, para finalizar, quanto ao grado de sucesso do programa, o que podemos dizer é que atualmente a estrutura do modelo de concurso é já operacional e testada, e que podemos também dizer que os níveis tarifários são competitivos. Se vocês olham o diagrama lá, os resultados do Uganda, temos o resultado do concurso e temos o que é a nova política com a tarifa de 30 centavos. Estes resultados estão em linha com os de outros países, tendo em conta o nível de subsídio. Esta figura é interessante para ver estas diferenças entre modelos de mini-redes, alguns mais privados, como o Nico já apresentou no caso da Serra Leoa, alguns mais públicos ou 100% públicos, no qual a companhia de eletricidade vai fornecer o serviço para as mini-redes, com tarifas mais baixas, mas com muita necessidade de subsídios, e temos modelos mistos, modelos com um subsídio parcial, como o caso do Nigéria ou o caso do Uganda. E finalmente, o que também é interessante, voltando ao caso do Uganda, é que agora temos um forte interesse de diferentes doadores, doadores internacionais que estão a financiar ou a discutir uma possível financiação de até 1.500 novas mini-redes. Aqui talvez uma lição aprendida que é interessante é a importância de coordenar projetos piloto com potenciais financiadores de grande escala para acelerar este processo. Finalmente, em relação às barreiras ou fraquezas, como já expliquei, faltou consenso inicialmente sobre a questão tarifas versus subsídios, o que implicou atrasos no processo. Inicialmente não houve nenhum limite tarifário e as tarifas foram mais elevadas do que o previsto, e depois o regulador fixou o limite de 30 centavos. Depois, o fato que os contratos têm uma duração de 10 anos é algo que reduz a atratividade para o setor privado, é algo que os desenvolvedores vão sempre dizer, e que os atores do setor, no caso do Uganda, conhecem e estão a tentar de solucionar. E, finalmente, o que expliquei, relativo aos novos regulamentos de mini-redes que não estão ainda aprovados, o que continua de ser uma fonte de incerteza para os doadores e para o setor privado. Então, muito obrigado. Se vocês têm qualquer dúvida, questão, eu posso tentar de responder. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Diego, very much for your presentation. Yeah, very interesting as well, for the case of Uganda and the learnings there. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the last part of our session today. We have 10 minutes, a little bit more, for some questions. We have a raised hand, Mr. Felipe Mondlane. Yes, please, you can ask a question.
Opportunity.
Thank you.
I'll give.
Sorry, Felipe, the line is breaking. We cannot hear you.
No.
Please try again.
Can I have a question in between?
Just a second, Mr. Vaz, just a second. Mr. Felipe, do you want to write the question in the chat box, Felipe? And I can read it. Okay, just a second, Kemal. Let's try to address Mr. Mondlane's query, and then we come back to you.
Actually, Mr. Mungan said he will write it, so we can proceed with Mr. Kemal.
Okay. Kemal, please.
Yeah, thank you. My question is related to slide number 17. If you can put it slide 17. I would like you to explain a bit this case of Ethiopia and Senegal. Apparently, they go for the 100% subsidy. Can you explain that part? I didn't really understand. Ethiopia and Senegal.
Okay, sure. I mean, the main idea of this diagram here is to show that there is a very clear relationship between subsidy levels and tariffs. And then it's not visible in the graph, but there is also a relationship between these choices and the delivery model that you implement. And then in the case of Senegal and Ethiopia, the basic idea is that they are using the national tariff for mini grids. They want to use the same tariff for both on-grid and mini grids. And that means that, well, in the case of Senegal, it's around 20 cents, $20 cents. In the case of Ethiopia, it's around 10 cents, if I'm correct. And that means that on the one hand, the initial investment needs to be 100% subsidized. And then even there is quite a chance that OPEX costs need to be subsidized over time in order to ensure these tariffs levels. So it's quite unlikely that a tariff level of less than 10 cents or around 10 cents can even cover operating expenses and ongoing operational costs. So that's the reason why they're here in the right side of the diagram. It's a political decision to have the same tariff everywhere, be it in the cities or in rural mini grids.
Yeah, let me shed some additional light here. In Senegal, this is a rollout scheme managed by the government. They tender out the installation of mini grids EPC. So once they are installed and fully paid by the government, they hand them over to the concessionaire. Senegal is split into 11 concession areas, which are operated by certain, usually international, larger utilities or consortia around larger utilities. And these will now be obliged to also operate the mini grids, even though these concessionaires are not very much interested in this, to be honest. And by doing so, the government of Senegal believes that they can reach some economies of scale to reduce the demand for ongoing cross subsidies from the main grid tariff to the mini grid tariff. But in case there is a need for cross subsidies, this is automatically done because the concessionaires operate main grids and mini grids distribution networks. So now Ethiopia is a different case where there's the EEU, which is the national utility. There is no privatization of the national distribution network in Ethiopia. And EEU will be mandated to install mini grids. They will tender out the mini grids EPC and they will operate them themselves. In Ethiopia, there will also be a private, and then by operating them through the national utility, there is the opportunity also to cross-subsidize the tariffs in mini grids from the main grid customers. Even though the EU is somehow trying to argue that they don't want to do this, they don't want to cross-subsidize, they will probably be forced by the government to actually do so. Now, there is also a private sector window in Ethiopia, but that private sector window does not have any opportunity to receive cross-subsidies, ongoing cross-subsidies. They can receive high capex subsidies, but no cross-subsidies. And there is a cost of service tariff model And it's very likely that the tariff expectation are still that some, like especially the household customers, pay the same as the main grid household customers for a few kilowatt hours a month. And then beyond that, everybody pays a higher cost covering tariff that cross subsidizes the first kilowatt hours. That was it from my side. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation.
Okay, thank you very much. We have the question written by Mr. Felipe Mondlane in the chat box. Let me read it. It says, actually, our scenario is more public intervention, but we are moving for this scenario. Uganda. Yes.
Hello. Hello.
Yes. Hello.
Yeah. Can I speak in Portuguese?
Yes, but let me finish with the question from Mr. Felipe Mondlane, and then we can take yours. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, obrigado. So Mr. Mondlane was saying our scenario is more public intervention. Yeah. But we are moving towards this scenario presented, the one in Uganda. Mr. Mondlane says, I would like to know more about, I guess, the tariff approach, reflective cost, or one same tariff for all the country. And what are the challenges for these mini grids? And secondly, what are the main lessons in order to avoid less interest or attractive conditions from developers? Mr. Felipe Mondlane is from FUNAI. Yeah? So, yeah, any of the presenters, Diego, if you want to address this?
Yes. So in the case of Uganda, with the model that was used during the pilot tenders, tariffs were variable, or in other words, developers were free to submit whatever tariff they thought they required. So the subsidy amount was provided. Developers would get a given subsidy per kilowatt installed, and then they needed to calculate what tariff allowed them to recover the operational costs, and then their fraction of the capex, and then their profit expectation. So that's how it was done in the first few pilot tenders. With the new model, which sets this new tariff cap at around $30, the idea would be that the tariffs are still cost reflective, but the way to reflect or to consider these costs is through the subsidy. So the tariff will be the same for every mini grid under this scheme, but then developers still can calculate and then communicate what level of subsidy they need to reach this tariff. So in the end, developers are still meeting their estimates and their profit expectations. The only difference is that the tariff is set, and then the subsidy is going to be moving. And then, the logic of the tender is that among the different developers that submit their bids, and considering those who are technically responsible, the one with the less subsidy requirement, who is able to meet this 30-cent tariff, then wins the tender. So in a way, it's not better or worse for developers as such. It's just a different mechanism to award projects. In terms of how you might make it interesting for developers, well, you might need to have enough subsidy for them. So whatever developers are asking at the tender stage needs to be available. And then the idea or the expectation is that developers are also attracted by the larger scale of the process. We would be, currently with these new phases, in particular KfW is interested in developing around 100, 150 mini-grids, and then the Green Climate Fund up to 600 mini-grids. We would be talking about bundles of around 100 mini-grids. So the expectation is that there are some significant economies of scale in there, and enough volume for developers to be attractive. I don't know, Ashley, Nico, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, that is all true. And yes, scale is definitely of most interest to the private sector investors and developers. As I said in my presentation, I think clusters of 25, 30 villages under one management. That is the minimum target. Like preferably, of course, higher numbers of villages, like 50, 70, 80, 100 under one management. That is interesting. The more villages, the better. But I think the most important aspect of attracting private sector is a stable regulatory framework. A framework, especially when it comes to tariff regulation, that basically maintains the balance. You may remember this picture of the scale that I showed in my presentation. And the role of the regulator is to keep the scale in balance. Now, in some African countries, governments had intervened and brought the scale to being not in balance. And like one famous example is Tanzania, where currently the mini-grid sector is simply going down. Like mini-grid companies are going bankrupt because the government artificially reduced the tariff without providing additional subsidies. So therefore, whenever you say, like the government says in Mozambique at the end, well, the tariff is too high, we want to reduce the tariff, you cannot just say, okay, there is a decree now, or there is a directive to reduce the tariff. You also have to provide the subsidies to reduce the tariff in order not to destroy the mini-grid sector and to leave mini-grid customers without electricity supply. And as long as this balance, as long as this scale exists and the methodology behind the tariff calculation stays constant, that creates the trust that investors need to go and invest.
Okay. Thank you very much. We had a pending question, Señor Estancio. Chumbitico, you wanted to ask something in Portuguese?
Sim, sim.
Please.
Sim, sim. Bom dia.
Bom dia.
Bom dia, está a me ouvir?
Sim.
Sim, queria agradecer a apresentação do Diego. Muito obrigado pela apresentação. Só queria perceber melhor quando falava dos subsídios do governo. O governo subsidia até a área de distribuição. Sim, queria perceber aí se existe um período estipulado onde o governo só vai subsidiar a distribuição até talvez 2, 3 anos, ou basta que se constrói esse mini-rede, o governo vai subsidiar todo o tempo da sua implementação em termos de gestão no que diz a distribuição. Porque queria perceber, porque é na distribuição onde há maior problema de quedas, de perdas, e é onde o privado também pode apresentar a sua melhor tecnologia para prover competitividade. Agora, se há subsídio o governo subsidia a distribuição, fico assim com reticência em termos do investimento do próprio privado. Não estou a ver qual é a área que ele vai fornecer o seu capital para desenvolvimento desse sistema. porque ele deveria exatamente por o governo está lá a subsidiar, fico assim em dúvida. Ou talvez o governo vai subsidiar num período X, após esse período privado.
Sí. Hola?
Okay, I think I got the question.
Okay.
Not the very last bit, but otherwise I think I got the main question. Então, é uma questão muito boa. A distribuição no caso do Uganda é uma contribuição, uma espécie pela REA. Então, a REA vai fornecer a rede de distribuição. Isto é o mesmo esquema que temos nos projetos ligados à rede, nos quais a REA também vai fornecer, não a REA, mas o governo vai fornecer os ativos de distribuição. Mas, primeiro, temos risco que esta rede de distribuição não vai estar lista, não vai estar construída no momento no qual a geração já foi instalada. Isto é um risco para os desenvolvedores. E depois temos o risco, como você falou, da qualidade da instalação ou do fato que a rede de distribuição precisa de chegar para todos os usuários, os clientes da mini-rede. O modelo no caso do Uganda é que uma vez que a rede de distribuição é fornecida pela REA, temos um contrato de utilização da rede pelo desenvolvedor da mini-rede, que se torna-se responsável do mantenimento da rede de distribuição pelo período de 10 anos do contrato de operação da mini-rede. Então, as reparações, os mantenimentos da rede de distribuição deve ser feito pelo desenvolvedor da mini-rede. Mas é verdade que isso é uma questão que está a ser discutida, porque os desenvolvedores percebem um risco neste modelo.
Okay, thank you, Diego. I think we have Irene. You also wanted to chip in very quickly because we are out of time, but you wanted to add something, Irene?
Yes, Paul, thank you. Just 2 points on the discussion before on the 30 cents tariff. Again, I cannot stress this much, that if a tender is being tendered with 30 cents and the developers have to apply to the level of subsidy needed, is not the same as free fixation of tariff because of the demand. We don't know how the demand is going to react to 30 cents tariff. So this is a huge risk of demand that has to be taken on the side of the developer and that investors are not willing to take. And one example of that is Togo. And the second point is about the comment of Nico of the stable regulatory framework. I cannot agree more with that. For me, the important part is not to have everything right down now, because I think that's impossible. Mini-grids are new to Mozambique, so there will be changes, and that's for sure. But what needs to be clear is what are the rules for these changes? For example, to provide one clear example, in the case of Benin, we are developing 40 mini-grids there. And what we are doing is to discuss a concession contract since the beginning. It's taking some time, to be honest, but still is completely worth it because we are having the opportunity to discuss with the regulator and with the Rural Electrification Agency to clarify everything. When the tariff is going to be reviewed, what mechanism can we use? How is it going to be done? And now we have a stable framework that has been discussed directly by the developer with the authorities. And I think that's key to understand each other and to understand the barriers of each other. We need to open a dialogue between the developers and the agencies to find a solution for both of us. Otherwise, for developers, we end up in the situation in which we don't find investors. And that's our main problem. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Irene. We are out of time, but if there's any really burning issue, possibly from any of the Mozambican institutions, there's still one last chance. Any quick reaction, final comment? Okay, so with that, colleagues from Get Transform from GIZ, Ashley, I think we can close the session. If you want to have any final words, Ashley. Hello, Ashley or Diego?
Nothing else really from my side. I don't know if there are some formal closing words from Ashley. I'm not sure if he's now in the room. Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Hello,
I
Ashley.
just thank you to Paul, to the ERC, to organising, and to everybody for taking part. And just to let you know that I put the link in the chat here where you can find the reports.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ashley. Okay, so I think we can close the session. It has been very interesting. Have a lot of attention, and we had a nice set of questions and interventions. So, on behalf of our team, thank you very much for being here today. And remember, we still have some sessions as part of this course, our normal routine on Fridays, and then next week we will be sending you the materials and the schedule for the coming sessions. So thank you very much. We can close the session now. Have a good day, everybody.